Now I'd like to welcome Mr. Peter McFadden to the stage.
I'm going to now introduce George. We know George is partly, or the main reason why many of you have come. But when we were sitting just now talking about, how we're going to run this, and George says, do you want me to do a talk, or are we going to just run it with questions and so on? And we decided to do the latter. But we were saying, or I was saying, that I think that climate change report is going to kind of dominate a lot of people's thinking. And George said, well, you know what, actually, I'm much more interested, or not more interested, but I'm really interested in another report that came out at the same time, which is from The Lancet, about mental health. And so I thought that's where we'd start. George Monbiot, Mental Health, The Lancet.
Well, thanks, Peter. It's not at all that I'm not interested in the IPCC report. It's just there was this striking convergence that on the same day we had something very similar, a global survey of what was going on with mental health, revealing the fact that we're facing a mental health epidemic, disastrous rise in conditions in mental ill health all around the world, which governments aren't taking seriously, they aren't dealing with properly, and it all sounded very similar to what's happening with the climate crisis, with climate breakdown, which is what I call it, because calling it climate change is like calling an invading army unexpected visitors. It's a woefully inadequate term for the existential crisis that we face. And the other good thing about it is that nobody ever says, so what, the climate's always breaking down. Whereas, if you call it climate change,
you're right.
You invite that response. So these two things published on the same day, which seem completely disconnected. Mental health, climate breakdown. How can you make that connection? Well, there's a breakdown in both cases, and it seems to me that they share at least some of their roots. And now, how can this be? Well, I think you can begin to open up this subject with this very interesting and useful word, alienation. And the amazing thing about alienation as a term is that it means many different things, but in my view, they all converge into the same place. You can be alienated from the work you do, disconnected and not actually in charge of it, not in control of it, somebody else taking the major product of your labor away from you. That's very much the Marxian approach to alienation, though, of course, his definition of it didn't stop there. You can be alienated from each other. You can be alienated from the rest of the living world and from the material world in general. And you can be alienated from yourself. And the sort of loss of self, the loss of the sense of who you are, of self-belonging, is a major component of alienation. Now, all these and other forms of alienation converge like the cracks in a dam into psychic rupture, converge into a sort of generalized mental breakdown which corresponds to the climate breakdown. Now, what does climate breakdown have to do with alienation? Well, a huge proportion of this is driven by consumerism. I mean, consumerism, which is a necessary concomitant of economic growth, because those people who are targeted by corporations, by very rich people who want them to buy their products and services, are principally those who have disposable incomes, for obvious reasons, which means that, by definition, their needs have already been met. And probably their strong desires have already been met, and probably their weak desires have already been met. So basically, you have to sell them stuff they don't need and they don't want. And the only way you can do that is by saturating people in the consumerist mindset to the extent that it becomes universal. It becomes the plastic soup in which we swim. We can't see it anymore. It is this universal ideology, saturated with advertising, saturated with marketing, and then inviting it into our own lives, believing we're inviting in something completely different. And what I'm really talking about in this case is celebrity culture. And celebrity culture is treated as being something harmless, just a bit of fun. It is absolutely not. Celebrity culture is at the heart of all this, and it's absolutely essential to pointless consumerism and economic growth, because the celebrity is the mask the machine wears. If you are trying to sell something to someone, some pointless gizmo, some sort of Wi-Fi-enabled egg tray for your fridge, you have to make some connection with that person. And if you are a private equity firm who owns this company, whose only corporate existence is a filing cabinet in Panama City, it's very hard for people to make that connection and to say, oh yeah, I relate to that, I want to be part of this. So what do? You bring in someone who pretends to be your friend. And when Kim Kardashian comes up on Snapchat or Instagram or whatever feeds she uses and says, hey, I've been using this fantastic new thing. It's an airbrush. Did you know you needed an airbrush? This is amazing. It's such a good airbrush. You can stick it in one ear and it brushes the inside of the other one.
Perfect.
And you think, hey, this is...
I need that.
Yeah. No, what you think, you don't think I need that. You think, this is my friend.
Sure.
She's talking to me. I know her because I see her all the time. I see her more often than I see my next door neighbor. So I must know her, and she must know me, and she becomes the mask that they wear. And so you become embedded and imbued in her life and her culture, even though she's not remotely connected with yours and probably wouldn't want to be in a million years, because she probably thinks you're scum, basically. I know, I'm imagining, but that's probably how it is. Now, there's some very interesting research on this, and it shows that people who spend more time getting celebrity news than general news are, by comparison to that other group, 3 times less likely to be involved in community activity and less likely to volunteer. They are also considerably less likely to vote, and most importantly of all, considerably less likely to protest. This is the deadening force which disconnects us, not only from each other and the world and the politics of the world, but also ultimately from ourselves. It shuts us down, it shuts us off. We become these disconnected consumers. And when you consider that the majority of our emissions are actually outsourced emissions, it's about 53% of the emissions.
Ours, when you say ours as Britain or ours as...
as the UK's emissions. Yeah. About 53% of them are actually made on our behalf by other nations and embedded in the products that we then buy from those other nations, particularly China. You see how that alienation, which arises from the need to sell us pointless stuff, which is at the heart of economic growth and is a sort of central project of our time, brokered by celebrity, is actually directly feeds in to climate breakdown as well. We have alienation at the heart of both.
Fascinating. and yes, both to mental health. And I wrote it down because you said it, that next door neighbour, and reading out of the wreckage, sort of knowing your next door neighbour is a very important part of that, isn't it? And various projects and ways that people are doing things which I guess we used to do, or our parents certainly did and don't.
We cannot build lasting political change unless community is at the heart of it. And they used to understand this. I mean, the old labour movement, going back 120 years ago, were fundamental part of that project was building community groups. Groups built around neighbourhoods, groups built around projects, groups built in the workplace, obviously, hobby groups, holiday clubs. They had the Clarion Cycling Club, the Workers' Education Association. All these they saw as absolutely essential if you were to have lasting and meaningful and deep political change. And we have kind of forgotten that.
Sure.
We kind of imagine that you just need to generate a national movement and then the national movement's going to do everything for you. Obviously, you need the national movement as well, and in fact, you need global movements as well. But so much of what is important is on your doorstep, and we've become shy. We sort of withdraw from that arena, whereas I think in some ways it is the critical one. Now, what makes this particularly interesting, and I don't have to tell you this, of all people, is that there's a science behind this, as we know. There's a science of how to build a participatory culture. Some amazing work done by Tessie Britton and others on behalf of Lambeth Borough Council. They produced this 400-page report looking at how you get people involved in community projects. And they found that there is a sort of stepwise thing, particularly with low threshold, low commitment stuff, like eating together. You know what the word companion means?
Sure.
You do, most people don't. It comes from companes, with bread. Eating together is a fundamental component of companionship and togetherness. And so very simple things like that. And then you start building it, and you can build it into more complex things. What it does straight away is to connect you with people you might not otherwise have been connected with, people who are outside your immediate social group, because you suddenly find that lots of different kinds of people want to do a similar thing. I think of the Allotment Association that I'm in, where there are people from about 50 different nations, first or second generation immigrants there, all classes, all ages, and it's a fantastic opportunity to connect with people and see those people as being people like me, because they love doing the same thing. And suddenly you overcome those more obvious religious barriers or skin color or class or background or place of origin and all the rest of it. Suddenly, those are much less relevant than the fact that we're all doing the same thing in the same place.
And the quality of your pumpkins.
Yeah, quite, exactly. Yeah, apples in my case mostly. And so you got that connectedness, and then it seems to me, well, it's not enough to stop there, as you well know. And on the basis of a participatory culture, you build a participatory politics. Flat pack democracy being a great example, Better Reykjavik being a fantastic example too, where basically the entire population plans the city. It's just amazing. And then on the back of that, you build your participatory economics, particularly participatory budgeting of the kind pioneered in Porto Alegre in southern Brazil, but now picked up in many other places as well, which has a transformative, dramatic effect everywhere where it's practiced at scale. And then I feel the next step after that is to start building that totally neglected fourth sector of the economy up, which is the commons.
Okay.
Now, when we talk about, when we position ourselves politically, we tend to position ourselves along a spectrum between market at one end and state at the other. And if you're on the right, you say, I want more market and less state. And if you're on the left, you say, I want more state and less market. And as a result, we have these sort of polarized slanging matches across that divide. But there's a much more interesting way of engaging with this, which is that there are actually four main pillars of the economy, two of which we completely forget in these debates. There is the market and there is the state, and I believe both are important, have particular roles to play, but they need to be constrained, both of them, quite severely. But then there's the household, the core economy. Without the household, there's no other economy. And because we don't think about the household, we neglect massively the work of women, who are still the core providers within the household. I mean, the major providers within the household. Their work is massively neglected. There's a wonderful book by Catherine Marsal called Who Cooked Adam Smith's Dinner?
Right.
And it turns out that while the great man was writing The Wealth of Nations, his long-suffering mother, Margaret Douglas, was making his meals and ironing his clothes and making his bed and doing all the things without which he couldn't have written this book. But her hands remained invisible. And so as a result, he wrote this entire book without ever once mentioning the household economy on which everything else is founded, because he couldn't see it. I mean, he was literally writing about the invisible hand while the invisible hand was all around him. But then there's a fourth sector, which is even more neglected, and that is the commons. And the commons, my allotment association, is a classic example of a commons. There's the three elements which make it a commons. So first one is a resource, which is the land, the plot of land that we work. The second is the community, which manages and controls that resource. And the third is the rules and negotiations developed by that community for the effective and equitable management of that resource. And either the resource itself, which is the case with the allotments, is divided equally, or the product of the resource is divided equally. And, more importantly still, when it comes to environmental matters, A true commons, like an allotment association, is meant to be maintained in perpetuity, and it is inalienable. Inalienable. It cannot be alienated. It cannot be sold or given away. And in there, you see the roots of both sustainability, because this is something which we want to maintain, that resource forever. We're not going to flog it off like some hedge fund might do. But also the sense that, wait a minute, if the land is alienable, so is our attachment to the land. There is a counterweight to alienation happening right here. Now, the commons is neither communism nor capitalism. It's something, it exists in its own sphere. Other examples would be, for instance, community land trusts.
Okay. I was going to say, can you give us some more examples? And
well,
particularly the things you'd like to draw back into the commons that aren't currently in it.
Yeah, well, there are models in academic publishing now fighting this sort of incredibly ruthless practitioners who own the companies like Elsevier and Springer Verlag and the rest, who own Taylor and Francis, who own these most of the academic journals and charge you enormous amounts of money. Well, in response, people have created an academic commons around journals such as PLOS ONE and stuff like that. There are various digital commons which people are creating. Not all of them exactly meet the definition of a commons, and the best commons are the tangible ones when it involves a physical resource you could actually see and engage with, and land-based ones are the most obvious ones, but there's water commons, fisheries commons, where you have a cooperative of fishers who exploit and maintain that resource. But you know, the two most obvious and outstanding ones in the UK are the allotment associations and the community land trusts.
Okay.
And so I feel that you know, that is the obvious next step, to start shifting material resources, actual wealth, out of the hands of both the private sector primarily, but also secondarily the state, and into the hands of community control. Is an absolutely key next step towards this embedded and long-lasting political change that I know we both seek.
So the way we're trying to do that in Frome, I guess, is to just do it. See what I mean? So we're a parish council, parish town council, who've basically said, you know, we are going to push power out, and we do quite a lot of what we call people's budgeting, because I can never say participatory. It's anyway, but that's what it is. It's the people's budget. So we're doing lots of that stuff. But do you have an optimism that that's rollable out, or that if there's enough people? I mean, I see it like pixels. Actually, those lights are quite good for it, aren't they? In the sense that, like, if there's enough dots, eventually it'll join up into a picture. Because my feeling is that we're never going to get permission from above, because turkeys won't vote for Christmas. And so it'll only happen, and it'll only happen in the scale and the speed that we need if it comes from below. But do you have any optimism, or is that complete pie in the sky?
I actually think we need both, and I think we can have both.
Okay.
Because there's a similar process which can take place at the national level, which is what's been called big organising. And it's very similar, because in this case you're creating a political community. And big organising, I mean, it's been done in different ways by different people. At scale, it's arguable that the first really impressive example of it was the independence campaign in Scotland during the independence vote. And basically what you're doing there is this radical devolution of responsibility away from the political leaders towards the followers. And you create a network of volunteers who then train other volunteers, and you create this proliferating network where you just bring more and more people in as replacements for the staffers you can't afford because you're not taking your money from the City of London and the big hedge funds and the other bastards.
Which was similar to what Bernie Sanders was doing?
Well, that's right. So Bernie Sanders then, the people around him were, and in fact it was two of his volunteer coordinators, Becky Bond and Zach Exley, who wrote this book called Rules for Revolutionaries, which explains how big organising works. It's not a great book, but it's got some great stuff in it. It's a bit chaotic, but it's there's some really, really interesting stuff about how you do it. And they took a candidate who, you know, had 3% name recognition when he announced his candidacy and no money, which in American politics is not a great place to start. No. And he very nearly clinched a Democratic nomination. And now those same people then, after that, moved away from the Sanders campaign because they felt he wasn't pushing things hard enough and fast enough. And they, quite independently of the Democratic Party, went scouting for candidates. And what they were looking for was people like you. They were looking for community organizers, people who were deeply embedded in their own communities, doing great things, who were respected, who were part of the community, feeling the same pain as the people that they were working with the same problems with zero-hour contracts and crap housing and all the other things which they were meant to be talking about, but, you know, the sort of helicopter-down Democratic leaders weren't connected with that at all because they're all millionaires. And so they were looking for those people, looking for highly inspiring people. And among others, they found Ayanna Pressley and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. These two extraordinary, inspiring women who came properly from the grassroots, who beat the Democratic incumbents in the primaries and are now almost certain going to get seats in the House of Representatives as a result. And this is just the beginning. So they've proved it can work. They've proved they can actually topple. I mean, they were in the case of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in New York. They were fighting a Democratic incumbent who had, I think he was ninth term. Right. And he had something like 12 times as much money to throw into the campaign as she did, and he was just cruising it because he thought, you know, he just got in all the other times. That's right. And she absolutely wiped the floor on that election and just walked in with a massive majority, and she's become the sort of icon now of the radical wing of the Democratic Party. Which is
surely what we need.
Yeah, and they're demonstrating it can work. Now, Corbyn and Momentum did something very similar. They brought over a couple of Sanders organisers to show them how to do it, which is what turned it round from being the total rout, which everyone was predicting. I mean, the only argument in The Guardian at the time was, are the Tories going to get a 100-seat majority or a 120-seat majority, to depriving the government of its majority. And that was done through big organising. And what it is based on this thing called radical trust, where instead of saying, right, we've got a bunch of experts in the middle who are going to make all the big decisions and do all the big stuff, we're going to farm this out to volunteers, train up a core group of volunteers who will then train the next wave, who will then train the next wave, and they will be the people who connect with everybody else. And so the Sanders campaign, they, in just a few weeks, spoke to 75 million Americans. They organised 100,000 events, all done by volunteers.
And do you know if there was any sort of listening as well as talking in that? I mean, were they sharing Bernie's ideas, and just as Momentum will be sharing Jeremy's, or was there a sense that there was a flow the other way as well?
Well, this is where, I mean, in both those cases, the timeline was too short to do a big sort of participatory democratic process. But this is where the sort of flat-pack democracy principles / Better Reykjavik / some of the stuff they're doing in Seoul, very interesting stuff going on in Seoul in South Korea, / Porto Alegre stuff comes in. That's much longer term.
Of course.
You can't do meaningful participatory democracy during an election campaign, but you can do it over the course of years, getting people to shape what not just their parties stand for, but their local, regional, and national government stands for.
Because to me, I mean, hopefully the people who get in are also committed to that other process. We had a guy who I think you may know called Karen Ross, who made a film called The Accidental Anarchist, which is an extraordinary film. He came to Froome last week and talked to us. And at the very end, it was sort of like, okay, last question. And the woman said, so, I think that Jeremy Corbyn's going to solve everything, and he's absolutely got all the answers. What's your comment? I paraphrased slightly. And he said, he sort of paused. He's a very considered, ex-diplomat. And he said, well, I know Jeremy really well. We've worked on lots of things together. He's a fascinating bloke. He's enormous integrity. But I still don't think that having a tiny group of people telling the rest of us what to do is the way we should do things. And I think he's right. I mean, but I agree, it takes longer.
It does. And actually, encouragingly, Labour seem to be quite open to this. They're much more interested, even than they were at the last election, in both participatory democracy and in community solutions. And they're now, I know there's talking to them, thinking about some ways of finding a radical devolution of power to communities, to the community level. They're quite anarchistic themselves nowadays.
Good. Because when we came in as Independents for Frome, it was partly on the promise of localism, which I sometimes wonder if anyone actually remembers that guy who was, David Cameron was his name, but he's completely disappeared. Anyway, he promised us, he said, we need to take the power from the political elite and give it to the man and woman on the street. So we thought, yeah, we'll have that. And that was the Localism Act, and the localism bit, which from our point of view has turned out to be pretty much universally hopeless, because local turned out to be way higher up. It wasn't local at all. You know, the power's sort of stuck at a district and a county level. So from our point of view, it simply hasn't worked. But I mean, so if there's something new coming that actually genuinely gives power, and I think that's, going back to what I was saying about opportunity and crisis, I think that the crisis of austerity potentially creates an opportunity, because actually, you know, Somerset is bankrupt. I mean, they cannot provide. Therefore, if we don't do it, we at the bottom level, so they need to allow us to do it, is my hope.
Well, I remember soon after this whole big society thing that Cameron was pushing had really been exposed as a con that it was, where basically we're cutting everything, so you, the volunteers, should take up where the state leaves off. But we're not going to give you any resources to do it. We're not going to give you the money that we've cut from state provision. Just do it by yourselves. And without any preparation, without any idea of, you know, a participatory democracy behind this devolution of power. You know, you can't just dump it on people. You've got to build it. You've got, as you know, you've got to build it from the bottom up. And the absolute denouement of all this was when Cameron wrote a letter to Ian Hudspeth, the chair of Oxfordshire County Council, and Cameron's constituency of Witney is in Oxfordshire, saying, I don't understand, why have you cut all the children's centres? And Hudspeth wrote back saying, 'cause you cut all the money, you plonker. and Cameron, you know, this, I got a leaked copy of this letter. It was absolutely mind-blowing. It was this, the comparison I made was with that moment in The Quiet American, you know, Graham Greene's novel, where this American agent who's been in charge of this bombing campaign, this sort of terror campaign in Vietnam, and he had come up with this plan to blow up people's bicycles, to put sort of fake bike pumps on the bicycles which are packed with explosives. And then he goes down to the square in the city to inspect the damage and see if it's worked. And he's wandering around and he suddenly notices there's blood on his shoes. And he sort of stares in utter bemusement at this blood on his shoes. And it's like, how did that get there? Because he can't connect. No. It's alienation again, you know. And this letter was like, I could feel Cameron staring at the blood in his shoes and saying, how did that get there?
Yes. Good. Thank you, George. What we're going to do now is bring Suzy and Wendy up. Having, you know, explored a little of the mind of George Monbiot on 11th of October 2018 in Bristol, what we want to do you want to come up? So Suzy and Wendy are involved particularly in other work. Well, yeah, give them, why not? The plan is that each of them will say a little bit about what they do, and then talk a bit about how that interacts with what we've heard so far, before we go into opening this up much more broadly, and hopefully pick up on some of the things that George has been saying. You've got the mic, so you're going to go first, aren't you, Suzy?
I'm actually going to just check it works,
Sounds
and then
like
pass it to Wendy.
Oh, okay.
But I'm just also curious about...
20 minutes, half an hour?
Yeah, sure. Oh, that's a really good idea.
Cool.
Do you want to introduce
do you want to do the whole lot and introduce yourselves as well?
Yeah, why not?
Go on.
Yeah.
You might need to hold those really close, I think.
Is that better?
Yeah.
Can people hear?
Yeah.
I can't see, so you have to...
No, you can't see a thing from up here.
Thank you.
It's nice, actually. We're just talking to ourselves. It's way less scary.
Yeah, okay. So, Wendy Stevenson, and I'm working with an organisation called the Converging World. And actually, it started out as an us community, in a way, because of how it started. So, essentially what we do is we invest in renewable energy in India. And that seems a very long, long way from the community of Bristol. But it actually started in Trumagna, just over the hill, with the Go Zero project there. And fabulous project where people were talking about how do we reduce waste to zero, how do we reduce carbon emissions to zero. And there was a carbon offsetting company that came and said, you know, it'd be way more cost effective if you actually, you know, put light bulbs into townships in South Africa or somewhere like that, and it'll be much more cost effective in terms of reducing climate change. And some people said, really? We want to help our community here. And not only that, with the rate at which India and China are developing, what use is it us doing anything, really? So with that, most people went home, but a few people got together and said, well, why don't we try and meet an Indian or Chinese community that we can work together on climate change? And that was it. That was the start of it. And that was the us community bit, if you like. And serendipity had it, not long after the tsunami. A filmmaker was going there and to India to film. And they said, I'll put you in touch. And then there was a trip. And then we found it was the windiest place in India. It was John Pontin, actually, that went out there and said, I've got an idea, or we've got an idea. Let's invest in renewable energy there, leapfrog the developments that we've had. There's a lot of carbon, a lot of potential to build more coal-fired power stations. There's lots of people still off-grid. So let's invest, use money from here, invest in renewable energy there, and use the profit for social and environmental initiatives. And so that's what we do. And 10 years later, we've put in 3 wind farms, and we use the profit for social and environmental initiatives. And we're particularly focusing on reforestation. And it's bottom-up, partly because of the CO2 sequestration, but also because of the value that forests bring in every other way. It's not just about CO2 removal from the atmosphere, but it's also about the well-being, it's about livelihoods, it's about local water management, biodiversity, and the list goes on. And it's the most cost-effective way to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. I think we sometimes get a bit distracted by all this technology and green bling and more policy papers telling us things we've already known for the last 40 years. We could just plant more trees. And yes. And actually, when you look at it, so even putting renewable energy in India, we know we can put in a megawatt there, which is half or a third of the price per megawatt it is here, and we avoid twice as much CO2 emissions. So I don't want to see it as, we can sometimes get very parochial about this, but as a globe, it doesn't matter where that ton of CO2 is emitted, it's going to have the same effect anywhere. So yes, we've got to do it here, we've got to start here, but I think we shouldn't be put off by something that is just out of sight. So that's what we do at the Converging World.
Thank you. So just before Suzy says her bit, the trouble with having a set of notes which you sort of scribbled earlier and then keep adding to is that you miss things. And I get one of the things I remembered now I wanted to say is that, in a sense, we wanted to move the conversation very much with Wendy and Suzy into things that can be done, both as individuals, both as companies and with the money that we and others have, and as individuals. So sorry I missed that out. Now you can have your slot again.
Thank you very much, Peter. Thank you. And I'm really curious to ask Wendy some more questions, but I'll just do a really brief explanation of who I am. So I'm really, really delighted to be here. I'm going to have to do this so I can see everyone. I'm really delighted to be here, and it's a real honour to come and have the opportunity to speak to people, especially people who are in that process of coming out of university. I'm really conscious, being a mum and being a secondary school maths teacher, that the scale of the situation that people are looking at now and the opportunities that they have ahead of them to make some big changes are quite pressing. And so I'm very pleased to be here. So the part of the reason that I'm here is because I work with Dobby on a conference called the Tree Conference, which we started last year in Glastonbury. And Wendy came to speak with us, as well as Claire Dubois from the TreeSisters. And what we do is pull together a whole host of excellent, amazing projects, strategies, methods, and ways of working towards regenerating the Earth globally, but with a very, very strong focus on trees. because I really like them. So with that, I'm going to just ask Wendy some more questions. How is it that people investing in converging world, do they receive any financial returns, or how is that going to move forward?
Well, we experimented. At first it was donation as a model, and that kind of worked for a while. And then the crowdfunding kind of happened, and so we went through that phase. And we wanted to democratize, if you like, investment, because a lot of people, I find, a lot of individuals want to do something. They want to look at where they can put their money. So we experimented with democratizing that through crowdfunding, and we aimed it actually so that students of Bristol could actually invest. And they could lend us a £5, and we'd pay them 6%, and they get the £5 back after 5 years. And you know, we raised enough money to put in a wind farm. And so that was fabulous. And then we grew up a little bit more because we wanted to grow a little bit bigger, because we thought, well, we're still paying off Indian banks and we want to sort of put more money into reforestation and things. And so this takes us to a whole area, and what I'm really interested in is the barriers. So there are rules and regulations, and they've come from a good place, around actually offering investments. And it's fabulous what's happened in this country around community investment into community renewables, but there are a lot of rules and regulations around that. So it's not easy for me to just go and say, lend us a £5 again, and get the response that we need to be able to accelerate what we need on the planet. And it's kind of this tension between how much time have we got, and how long is it going to take me to raise this money? Now, if lots of people would come out, or lots of charities would come out and say, yep, we actually want to take this back. I'll give you an example. In India, we have big city funds like Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan, all investing hugely into renewable energy. In itself, it's not bad, and not everybody is a criminal in the city. You know, we are human. Everyone is human. But the business model is predicated on how much money can I make when I sell that wind farm. It doesn't come out of the place. We need renewable energy because we need a future for the people there and here, and we need this for future generations. And if it comes from a better place, then that would be great. But it's very expensive to access that kind of funding, and so that's one of the barriers. To list a company on AIM, it will cost you at least £1 million. So it's not easy. We don't have an offer open at the moment, but you know, when we do, then we'll let you know. But it's quite a difficult process. So what is AIM, and what would be listing on AIM? Okay, so this is, you'd have a company, and you would, just like in a lot of the community schemes here, people would buy a share of that company for £1 or 50p or £10, and then they get to own, they have ownership. And so if it's participatory democracy, then it means that, as we see it, the commons will own, if you like. So shouldn't it be that the commons own these things, rather than, you know, just some very rich fundraisers and that whole system there, just making more money and accumulating wealth? How do we democratize that? So you're saying, so you've got a charity that you've worked on that is investing in renewable energy. Yes. That is putting the proceeds of that investment into community through reforestation, and the process of floating on AIM therefore means that people can be investing in something that has this product of going into reforestation. That's right. So the charity exists, and we set up a company that would allow individuals to be owners of that too. So it's the charity is the majority shareholder, and then individuals. And it's that company that we are looking to list so we can raise more money to put into more renewable energy that will go into reforestation. And why would you choose to go into dealing with the financial markets at all? People said that to me when I worked in Westminster with the manufacturers. It's an interesting one. We have tried for many years to raise funds to grow that market, to put in more renewable energy, to invest in more renewable energy, so that we can use that money for reforestation as well as provide a financial return. And we have hit barrier after barrier after barrier. And I'll pitch this here now because we're at a university. For example, lots of universities and lots of charities have policy committees, and those committees will have restrictions around what they can invest in. And it's quite a challenge because lots have come out and said, we're not going to invest in fossil fuel, or we're not going to invest in this. But it's unless that committee proactively then looks for solid projects to invest in, where they're going to get the returns that they need, where it's going to do good, then you'll just hit stone walls. So and that policy needs to change.
So you're saying that by creating this model, you're able to create a situation where people can be investing in reforestation?
Yes, because the IPCC report said we absolutely need more reforestation. How do we do that? And how are people going to do that? One of the things that I'm really aware that you've pinpointed in terms of both the IPCC report and also the implementation of those Kyoto Protocol targets is that when we hear about news reports referring to becoming carbon zero by 2050, there's very little reference, well, there's a lot of reference to the need to cut emissions, but there's very little reference to the possibility of sequestering the carbon that's already in the upper atmosphere. And so one of the barriers that we're talking about, I wonder if you could say something about that. Yeah, so when we look at so the work that I did in Westminster was often sitting around very long, blah, blah, regulatory committees that would develop regulations that were meant to bring about and affect change. Now, some of the issues with that was that there was very little in terms of practical experience around the table. And when there's not the practical experience, there's therefore often not the imagination or the experience to be able to say, how will that really impact what I call the coalface, like on the ground? And I've seen a lot. So, for example, if we look at, we know that wind farms, for us, or renewable energy is just the engine to, it's needed, but it's just the engine to throw off the finances that will help to go into reforestation, which is hard to raise money for. It's green bling at the end of the day compared to we need more forests, and it's cost effective. Now, when we take the Kyoto Protocol, or when we take the Paris Accord, or when we take the Bond Challenge, and they talk about getting reforestation into the ground, when it comes to transposing that into regulation, setting mandatory targets for business and other institutions here in the UK, it actually works against it. It actually prevents them doing something around carbon neutrality, even if that's not the right way. It forces them into the most expensive solutions. And so it's madness. And I remember Plan B by Virgin and M&S and everybody else came out and said, oh, we can be carbon neutral by 2050. Do it through reforestation and you'll do it by 2020.
And what would be the cost ratio between doing it through sequestration?
Well, it's about 50 pence, if that, to reduce 1 tonne of CO2 through tree planting, whereas if you actually do it with cavity wall insulation, it's about £16, or it was. If you put in solar power, I remember it used to cost £900 to reduce 1 tonne of CO2. I mean, that's a few years ago, by putting solar panels on the roof. Now, £900 to sequester to avoid 1 tonne of CO2. Now, I'm not saying we don't need this, we do. But if there's a race against time, and we need to put in more forests to help remove, because it is one of the only solutions, it will remove it. The rest just avoid it, and it's expensive. So it's common sense. And so how do we do it?
Yeah. Well, I think identifying those barriers and working out how to shift them and articulate amongst the general public that those are things that we need to be shifted sounds like a really good move. Yeah. Absolutely.
I mean, I'm also interested as well in the disconnect. I mean, why is it that we don't connect with this? You know, we've become so separate. If you don't know the work of Charles Eisenstein, I recommend you read him. And he talks about the age of separation. And that's the age we've been living through, where we're so disconnected from the natural world that we don't feel it. And, you know, how can you care for something you know, if you don't love it, you know, if we love it, we care for it. And I feel very lucky that I went into this because I care and I love the environment. And for me, it feels like self-harm, what we're doing. And I'm just interested, Suzy, because you have been a school teacher. And I'm really interested to know, because I think it starts very young. We're driven by targets and performance very early on, and we move away from that. In your experience, how has this been seen to play out in the classroom, in your experience?
Well, I mostly deal with secondary. So while I have small children, I see a lot of amazing work happening in primary schools, and there is a lot of issues around pressure and targets and not spending enough time outside and all of that. But actually, secondary schools are my main area of concern with regards to the connection with nature. And I think the main thing that I notice is that we have a method of teaching and training people to understand about objective science, which asks them to look at something, objectify it, classify it, and then pass a judgment on some kind of sliding scale between good or bad, or like or dislike, or useful and not useful to me. And then at that point, once they've done that kind of classification, judgment, they can put it to one side. Now, if that's a tree, what they've done is effectively objectify it. Like, you could argue that people objectify women. They haven't actually understood a great deal about that thing in front of them. And I think really, in a way, both our science and our education has in the desire to cram full of facts, we've possibly almost educated people out of being able to really listen to the natural world and to accept or to understand that it may have something that it wants to tell us in reality. I mean, like, these things might be able to be communicating with us and communicating with us about how to take care of the earth and the ecosystems. And so, yeah, I think that, you know, pinpoint, that would be one of my major issues.
Do you want to just tell us a little bit more about the work that you're doing now around that and some of the people you're in touch with?
Yeah, okay. So the process of having small children, I found quite isolating. Maybe I was a little bit alienated from my culture. And a part of how I coped with that was I went and sat with trees. And I found that I got a lot of support. And I found I was able to process my emotions in a way that helped me to make sense of things. I started to notice that when I was sitting with different trees, I was getting different themes of thoughts and ideas. And I started following and researching those thoughts and ideas, and found that there is some really amazing ecosystems science going on out there. I found Claire Dubois, the TreeSisters, which you're intimately involved with. I found Diana Beresford-Kroger, extraordinary revelations around how when trees are producing oxygen, they're not just producing oxygen, they're producing all sorts of minute aerosols that are medicating the upper atmosphere and helping cloud seeding. When we talk about all these various different cloud seeding, understanding that trees are actually doing that in this extraordinary way and medicating the waters and the earth. Like these huge pumping columns of this sort of extremely rich sort of perfume and chemicals into the atmosphere to benevolently. And once I started finding out about how extraordinary modern research is around trees, around ecosystems, I also started finding out that there's some amazing regeneration projects. There's the Wilding Project, there's projects working with regeneration with the soil and then planting. And there are, globally, the most astonishing number of these projects all over the world, amazing methods. I got so excited. And it is actually a bit hard for your family and friends if all you want to talk about is trees all the time. So I arranged a conference so I could meet all the people I was really interested in and talk to them about trees. And I also really, really interested in highlighting their work. So that's what we did last year. And it went really well because the opportunity to provide a forum where it was both conservationists and foresters who don't necessarily see eye to eye about which trees to plant. There's some big issues around whether or not it's okay to have Sitka spruce or whether it's okay to have cash crop timber. And then and what to plant for climate change. And then there's also the scientists who maybe struggle a little bit with the idea that there are tree empaths and there are people out there who do have a direct connection with nature and that they do learn that way. So what we did is provide a safe space for all of those different voices and expertise to come together with artists, with creatives, with project leaders and community people who are just really excited about what they can be doing in their local community. And it was really nourishing. It was really nourishing for the scientists, for there to be, we had Isla MacLeod, who's a tree speaker. She sat on the panel and was able to articulate her experience with trees, how she had gone through university. She had felt incredibly alienated. She had come out of that experience really feeling very lost about who she was. She was very intelligent. She did really well when she was younger, but she just couldn't make sense of what was going on. She went and spent quite a lot of time in the woods and developed this incredibly deep connection with trees. And so we had her there with Professor Sir David Reed, Professor Emeritus, but still, the author of Combating Climate Change, A Role for UK Forests, which is a seriously important piece of work around what the climate predictions are for the circumstances that trees will receive in 50 years that we're planting now. So the understanding that just planting what would do well now isn't necessarily kind for something that lives 100, 200, 300, in the case of yews, maybe 2,000, 3,000 years. So bringing them all together, and it was great, the scientists having the experience that somebody was actually saying trees were conscious and that they could communicate. And it was really great for the project leaders to discover that they could get their heads around the science, and it was okay for them to, to realize it was interesting, it's all doable, it's all actually really rather interesting. And the community council organising groups to see that actually there was a tremendous amount of support for what they were trying to put in through the neighbourhood plans, which I'm quite keen on. Some of that local level legislation, and in particularly with regards to what's been happening in the States about how it's really been the only level, it seems like they've been able to take on the powers that have been given to corporate entities. Which are a major part of where I'm interested in. After last year's conference, I felt in my bones that it is possible to halt deforestation of ancient growth forests. And there are legislative ways of doing that, particularly making it a crime in the international courts of law. Yeah. We all need to be really articulating this to other people. There are strategies for halting ancient growth deforestation, and we do need to be really clear about articulating what we want to see on that level. And also at a local level, when it is we see things like forest ecosystems, and therefore it's really hard to say, oh, well, how do you call that ecocide if you cut down one tree at a time? Maybe when does it become ecocide? But what seems to be a difficulty for them is to acknowledge forests give them rights as entities. And yet they can do that to a corporation.
It was exactly that was the breakthrough for us. So Frome, we're in the process of trying to acquire rights for the River Frome. And so we're in a council meeting, and this comes up as and somebody said, hang on a minute, you can't have a river. The river can't have rights. It hasn't got responsibilities. And then somebody else said, well, what about corporations? It's like, oh yeah, good point. It completely changed the sort of atmosphere within that room, and we passed that intention to, and we're in that process.
Do you want to give him a round of applause for giving the River Frome rights in the...
We haven't got there yet. Well,
on the road.
Well, onward, yeah. So I was just going to ask you, Suzy, in the sense, what you've been describing partly as one of the barriers, it strikes me, is that many of us, including me to a large extent, would find it a barrier to the, my thinking that trees might have feelings, all that kind of stuff. Yeah. And one of the things that Jake, I don't know whether you remember, but right back at the beginning, an hour or so ago, or an hour and a bit ago, Jake asked, there were two questions he had, which were, what's your vision, and also what are your barriers? And what we're going to do in a moment is go into the bar and go and have a pee if you need to, and all that kind of stuff. But what we wanted to do first was give you the opportunity, or ask you really, to turn to somebody, preferably somebody you don't know, and just enlarge upon that, or just discuss that a little bit between you. And it occurs to me that that's, certainly for me, that would be one of the barriers, and that need to really reconnect with nature. And because, as you say, how can we why do we want to be part of it and to protect it and stop it all from going pear-shaped unless we've really got that connection?
Well, and that's where that thing of it's so easy when you're in a culture that's so visual to think that what you're seeing in front of you is what it is. And I think that's what we've really learnt around our relationship with women, that how the 2D image has objectified women and what we actually know they're capable of and the depths and the brilliance. It's almost the case that that 2D image completely confuses you about what a woman actually is, her role within the community, her role within the family, her role spiritually to long for the earth that she needs, for her family, for her community. And I think it's similar with the natural world. And we've got very cut on what I would almost call sort of tree porn.
Tree porn, you heard it here. Well, probably not first, because you're calling it there. And there's got to be a connection into what you were talking about earlier on, George, in the sense, isn't there, of celebrities and that whole, which must also be, because usually one's connection with celebrity is going to be on a screen or on a newspaper, isn't it? And that's
well, it is the ultimate objectification. And it's also a particularly toxic objectification because it's all about how much better this person's life is than yours is. And the reason you want to follow this person is that you can see them living this life of fame and glamour and wealth, which you are not party to. And so it helps to create, I mean, this is why I think celebrity is so important, and it's not something, it's not an adjunct to the system, it's at the center of the system. Because the particular variant of capitalism under which we live, which we call neoliberalism, which is this notion that there should be no organizing principles in life other than the market, that any political action is by nature illegitimate because it interferes with the operations of the so-called free market, which again is a human construct, obviously. But the purpose of the market, which is much less examined when we're talking about neoliberalism, the purpose of the market is to discover a natural hierarchy of winners and losers. This is how the neoliberals like Friedrich Hayek and Milton Friedman and others see it. And their notion, they have this sort of social Darwinian notion that there is a natural hierarchy. And you can tell who should be at the top because they're the richest. And you can tell who should be at the bottom because they're the poorest. And if you're at the bottom, it's your fault. You are the undeserving poor, and whatever bad things happen to you, that's all down to you. If you're at the top, even if you inherited all that money, like Donald Trump, you deserve to be at the top because you're the natural winner. Now, the thing is that in any society, there are bound to be more losers than winners by nature. I mean, there is only going to be one winner of any race, and everybody else is going to be a loser. And at the heart of this sense of alienation and disjunction is this sense that we are all losers. Ultimately, we all lose the race, of course, but even while we're still alive, by comparison to these people who are thrust into our faces, we are necessarily losers. And so they both reinforce, through this objectification of their celebrity, they reinforce this sense that we are in a winner-loser society. We are the losers. We have to see ourselves as the losers and as the natural losers. Otherwise, we will rise up and revolt, which is what we ought to be doing. And celebrity helps to enforce that. At the same time, of course, it is profoundly alienating, as we were saying. It's alienating from our neighbors, it's alienating from everybody else, and it alienates us from nature just the same as well.
Yeah, and so in that sense of that you're going to go forward and have your break and everything, maybe what's fun to do is to give voice to the opposite side of that, which is actually the truth, which is that we are extremely powerful, and you all have really resplendent gifts, and unpacking those and creating a cultural norm of speaking about them and reflecting them to each other in such a way as we realize the sort of the infinity of power and which can be coming through us and our communities, something maybe I'd just like to make sure we mention.
Cool. I've also realized that as you go out for a beer or whatever else you want to go out for, we can reorientate things because Julian Hyde has some books out there which reorientate things in a sense because they are about some of the world's greatest trees. So they're sort of like they're making it's a book of celebrity trees. I've just realised. So so you can go and enjoy that and
objectified trees.
Yeah, exactly, objectified trees. So we're going to break now. So my invitation to you is to spend a couple of minutes with somebody and just have a bit of a think about what you've heard so far and where you're at, but then remind yourself of what's your vision and what your barriers are. And this is partly because there's quite a lot of you, and when we come to questions and so on, if some of that's been sort of lumped together a bit, so you'll think, oh, this person's question's really interesting. You can sort of have some little democracy going on there to decide what questions you want to chuck at us. So we're going to have, where are we now? About 20 minutes break. The bar will be open. The lights will go up on here, if all's well. You get a bit of light and we have less. So, as I say, I invite you to speak to each other. And when you come back, you might want to sit somewhere else. So you get to meet somewhere else as well. Good. We'll see you in about 20 minutes. Right, I want to restart, if we can. Blimey. Oh no. Okay. Actually, in a moment, will you put the lights back up on the house a bit, because I still can't see anything. Because as we go into Q&A, I'm still sitting here thinking I'm just talking to three lovely people, and then there's something out there somewhere. But anyway, hopefully we can change that. Just before we go into this, I just wanted to mention this lot, if any of you have not had a chance to speak to them. So this is Saving Hamilton House, which is an extraordinary project and actually ties in, we may get a word from them later, there's lots and lots of tying in with the things that particularly George was saying at the beginning, in the work that they're doing and trying to do in order to save Hamilton House, which is including a lot commons ownership. So we'll come back to that. We're all now properly dressed with our orange badges. I'm not sure about whether orange goes with my other... Anyway. So we're now going to go into Q&A. There's a couple of things I want to say about this. It would be great if you could just introduce yourself. You don't have to give the whole what you do and all the rest, but at least your name so that we can get a sense of who we're talking to. You ask them to put the lights on? Yeah. I'll get them to do that in a sec. And then the second thing is, there's quite a lot of you out there, so what would be great is if you can ask your question or make your comment, and keep it as short as you possibly can. Think about what it is that you want to communicate. Do that. And then if you could give the mic back to one of... We've got 2 mics and 2 runners. So if you could give it back to them, that'll enable them to then move it on to the next person. So that would be great. And could you change the lights around for me now? Please. Whoa, you do exist. Hooray. Hello. Cool. There's people. Could we have ours down a tiny bit more as well? You don't need to see us, really. No. Okay, great. That's even better. Thank you. And the third and final thing I wanted to say before we start this is it'd be great, I'd really like, or we'd like 2 or 3 women to be asking questions first. And if I can explain that to you why I want that to happen later if you want. But we'll have the first 2 or 3 questions from women, please. So, the floor is now yours. A woman on the end. Hooray, and a microphone immediately behind you. Go for it. Who are you?
Hi, I'm Natasha, and I am studying the coastal commons. And I'm interested to know whether you have read Christopher Stone's book from 1970s called Should Trees Have Standing? And it's about giving legal personality to nature. And I'm looking at the possibility of giving legal standing to the coast. And the question is, as we're seeing in Frome and in the River Dart in Devon as well, there are potential mechanisms of giving legal personality to nature. But we can't do that without people making the connection and maybe people representing nature, the river, the tree, the wood, the coast. How and what techniques do we need to facilitate that linkage?
Thank you. I'm going to give that mic back. So you're right with that? Do you want to take that, Suzy? Well, whichever of you wants to, really. Can I just say something else? That I don't know whether it's going to be possible to twist. You won't hear at all if we twist one of those mics. It's quite difficult for us to hear. So you'll need to be really clear because we haven't got the mics coming this direction. But we've got that. Thanks. Go for it.
The most recent sort of update on Christopher Stone's book, which is brilliant, is David Boyd. I'm wanting to, I hope I've got that right. The Rights of Nature, and that came out last year. You can get it on audiobook as well. And he has now gone forward to support the UN in their understanding of the application of the rights of nature. And he really brings along the debate, including really up-to-date information on legal cases. And some of the key ones I'd highlight to you would be the case in New Zealand with the Maoris, where they've gone a long way towards not just protecting certain lands, but doing it very specifically by articulating their ancestral relationship with the land as their ancestor, and also the recognition of the visible and invisible beings that they're intimately connected with in that landscape. And so another one I'd really profile would be the Sariaku and the Living Forest Declaration, which the Ecuadorian people are looking to have acknowledged in other countries. But it's a particularly brilliant 3-page document which goes a really long way of expressing that relationship between nature and humans in such a way as we can have the discussion around whether we can cope with the idea that there might be some really cool, clever things in nature, and move on quite directly with how we can start to legislate for that. But there are quite a few different examples now of that happening, and another one's Cormac Cullinan, who also charts the different places in the country in the globe where there's been some really significant advancements with that.
Okay, thank you. Do you want to add something? Yeah.
This ties in with a necessary step in any effective conservation or rewilding project, which is it has to have a community development component in it. And any project that you try to engage in, the ecology is the easy bit. You know, if you want to bring back trees, you can plant trees. In fact, you don't even have to plant them in a lot of places. You just stop the grazing or something, and they come back. But the crucial thing is always to not just have people's consent, but active involvement and ownership of the project, whatever it might be. And there's a great example now in the UK of trying to do this at a very large scale, where this group that I was involved in setting up, called Rewilding Britain, has just launched this Summit to Sea programme, going from Pumlummon, the highest point of mid-Wales, all the way down through the lowlands, across the estuaries, and out in Cardigan Bay, a huge area of land and sea, which they're hoping to rewild, but doing so entirely through the work of the community. And so the community becomes the driver of it, becomes the owner of it. And the whole idea is that you are regenerating communities, you are helping people to find jobs and income in a place where there's almost no jobs and income, you're greatly diversifying the economy, and the whole thing is built around creating a much richer set of natural ecosystems than we have at present. And you have to have the people at the core of it. You can't, if you try to protect nature without at the same time giving people something which improves their lives, it is going to fail.
Thanks. Okay. So now what I promised to do to our roving mics was do what I'm going to do now, which is say, so the lady with the pink top, and then over, can you come all the way out round? Oh, well, you can run round there, can't you? So you're the next one on the end there. Yeah, thank you. And then I'll get the next one after, so we can not have so much running. Hello.
Hi, I'm Heather. I am currently experiencing the idea that I am not doing enough for the environment, and I think I speak for many people in this room when I say that. You guys, I see as doing so much, and I am so grateful. I find this guilt an immobilizing force, and it's one of my barriers. So I would like to know whether you guys have had this feeling, and tips for overcoming that for all of us here.
Fine question. Top tips.
I think the short answer is yes. I think one never feels one is doing enough. But it's great to identify it as a barrier. And I think there's lots of things we can do, from, looking at what we consume and how we consume that, to, whether or not you cycle to work, walk to work, whether or not you take, how many journeys you take. And I keep coming back, having worked in this sector for nearly 30 years and heard the same policies regurgitated over and over again, is how do we make this happen? And I think it really comes back to a shift internally in our being about who we are, really knowing ourselves, reconnecting back with ourselves, and that's heart over mind, really connecting back there, and then really feeling and connecting back with nature, because we are one with nature and we become completely separate from it. And when we do that, I think we start to become stiller. And I think we fly around the planet, not just in aeroplanes, but even just because we can. We get in the car and drive to London for a party, or we drive back to wherever, and we do it because we can, and it's expected of us because we can. But I think there's something to be said to being much more stiller in our lives, in every way really, and to bring back the magic and the creativity and the space. Because I see children with large backpacks going to school who are driven by the same targets that drive the capitalist market, and we're churning out little automatons to add to that machine. So how do we step out of it?
Thanks, Wendy. You want to? Okay.
Peter, could I?
Okay, yeah.
Could I add something to this?
Quickly.
Look, I feel guilt all the time. I mean, being active, spending my whole life on these things doesn't relieve it. And in a way we ought to. You know, what do we call people who don't feel guilt? Psychopaths. We should feel guilt, but the guilt we should feel is a sort of structural guilt, not an individual guilt. Because the whole thrust of the system at the moment is to blame us for structural forces. We were talking about this before. You know, your credit card is maxed out. Well, nothing to do with the fact that your housing costs are impossible. It's because you're feckless. You haven't got a job. It's nothing to do with the fact that there's structural unemployment. It's because you're unenterprising. You feel you're behaving in a bad way towards the living world. But it's nothing to do with the fact that we live in a total saturated consumerist society. It's because you're a bad person. That's the way it works. It's all loaded onto us as individuals in this highly individuated ideology called neoliberalism, in fact, called capitalism, because capitalism itself drives towards individuation. And so what we have to see is that the guilt we have to accept is a societal guilt, not an individual guilt. And the forces we have to take on, of course we have to change our own behavior and we have to constantly address it and question it, but the real forces we have to take on, which enable us to change our behavior far more effectively, are structural forces, are the economic forces, are the political forces. That's why we have to get political, and why we can't just do this as consumers, we can only do it as citizens.
Thank you. Sorry I tried to hurry you up because that was really important. Suzy, you wanted to add a tiny thing.
My tiny bit is how massive we are, and in that moment when you still and you give yourself the space to really tune into you, it's not just guilt, it's grief. And the grief won't go away, probably for the next couple of generations, because we're going to lose so much. But coming to terms with that and coming into community around supporting each other around that, I think is actually deeply empowering in terms of tuning into what your gifts are and what it is that you feel motivated to do, and how you play your role, and how you can be really brave and stand up really, really big on that.
Thank you. Great. Thank you. I'm sorry, just before you start, let's have someone somewhere else over there. Okay, right over there near the speaker with the brand. Yeah, after this lady.
I'm Rachel from Bradford-on-Avon, currently working with our local climate change Zero Carbon by 2050 group. But formerly I was in international development, working to help vulnerable communities adapt to climate change and attending the UN climate conferences. So I wanted to talk about the reforestation that Wendy talked about, and bearing in mind what George said about the importance of community ownership of forests. And the challenge that when people do have access to trees, they often don't have the ownership. You know, they've got use of land, but somebody else owns the trees on that land. So there are structural challenges about reforestation. First, you know, that communities in many parts of the world getting ownership or, you know, being allowed to look after the trees. But the other thing is there's this insidious process of countries and corporations trying to offset their own emissions by buying land elsewhere and planting plantation forests, which are not the way to sequester the best carbon, and expropriating people because government's saying, oh, nobody uses this land. But of course they do. Pastoralists, for example, with their livestock on land that has trees on it. So what I want to understand is I totally accept that one way to get out of the mess we're in on climate change could be mass reforestation. But how can that practically happen when we've got so many people on so much of the land actually using it already?
Wendy.
Well, I think it goes back to what George was saying and also what Suzy mentioned and that you've actually raised. So thank you for raising that. It must be connected with community. And it must not be mass plantation of monocultures because it does very little for biodiversity. The projects that we work with, and I'll give you an example. One of our reforestation projects runs along the southeast of India on the Coromandel coast. And it used to be 1,000 kilometers by 30 kilometers of tropical dry evergreen forest. And today there are less than 4 hectares of full climax forest left. That's had a massive impact on the local population. The area is rain-fed, not river-fed. And because it's rain-fed and because of the mass deforestation, it means that the waters run off the soil and the soil goes with it and it goes into the sea, and then the soil can no longer support life. Not only that, increasing sea level salinates the water table. The locals looking for water don't always understand, so they will go through the salinated aquifer into the next one and polluting that one. And within 10 years, that area of over 700 square kilometers could actually be a place that you just wouldn't be able to live in. It wouldn't support life. What has happened is that just a handful of people, started by collecting seeds from the sacred groves because the trees tended to live around the temples, they tended to be left there. They collected seeds and started to germinate them with indigenous plants and trees. And from that, they started to grow the forest. Then a women's cooperative was initially set up, where the women who absolutely needed access to funds for their family and to support their family, because unfortunately, often the men would drink and gamble, and therefore it wouldn't. If you give the livelihood to the woman, it's more likely to help with education and everything else, as you may know. Women's cooperative was set up, and they actually germinate the seeds. They've set up a nursery, they've set up a second nursery, and they are actually then, we're buying the saplings back from them, a guaranteed amount for replanting, and then they are paid for 2 years to maintain those saplings so that there's a 90% success rate, which is much higher than the government reforestation. Because of the work that's going on there, they are now educating other states in India about ecological restoration. It's not reforestation, it's ecological restoration. And so people often say that, well, how do you guarantee that that forest will live on? Because people are interested in the CO2 reduction. Of course they are. But that's not the only thing. And so social fencing is a term that's been, that is used, because also there's work going on with 170 schools in that area around the importance of ecological restoration and how important nature is to them. So it has to be hand in hand. It can't be mass monoculture plantation. I agree.
Thank you. Okay. So we're going over there, and who's going to be after that? Okay, well, hang on a sec. I'll just go in the middle there, and then I'll come to you one after. So have you got that one? There's a lady, I can't quite see. In the middle somewhere. Yeah, fair hair. Over there.
Hi, my name's Rasheen. Whoa. Thanks for this, it's been really great. I work at the SU in campaigns, Bristol Students' Union. I'm really interested in what you said about kind of economic transformation and working to build the commons. But something that I've struggled with, and I'm sure a lot of people have, is that in order to survive in the current economy, you have to spend and dedicate so much of your life just to having a 9-to-5 job or longer to get by. And it takes a lot of time to build the communities that you say are like necessary to enable commons and participatory democracy and participatory budgeting. How do you see, I guess on a broad scale, how do you see that transformation taking place when we have an economy where people need to spend the majority of their waking hours just surviving? And then on an individual level, do you have any like advice or tips for if you only have a small amount of brain space and a small amount of time in your week to dedicate to a project, what's the most valuable thing that you can do towards building a new economy?
Thank you very much. This is a crucial question and beautifully articulated, thank you. In Britain, the key thing is housing. I mean, how many people in this audience pay rent? How many people spend more than 30% of their income on rent? More than 40%? Anyone more than 50%, perhaps? Couple? This is extraordinary. Basically, you are giving this money to someone who doesn't have to work at all. You are giving 30% or 40%, or in a couple of cases, 50% of all your working time to someone who can spend their entire life on a beach because you are subsidizing them. You are paying for them not to work. This is a grotesque situation which we have normalized. It's like, one of those many things that it becomes the water in which we swim. We don't see it, even though it is a grotesque injustice. And what has happened is that the land on which housing sits has become this speculative investment for buy-to-let landlords, often operating at a vast scale, hundreds or thousands of homes in some cases, which are, as far as they're concerned, they are simply a cash cow to be milked. Often appalling conditions for which you are paying huge amounts of money. So we have to deal, and I think this is absolutely crucial, and it might seem completely disconnected from environmental issues, from all the other stuff we're talking about. We have to deal with the fact that people are paying so much for their housing. We have to deal with the fact that people are being exploited by economic rentiers, basically taking money for nothing. And so with a bunch of very smart people, I'm working on a report on basically how we can do this, how we can make housing much, much cheaper than it is today, how we can curb the power of the landlords, how we can actually make even buying houses much more affordable, bring it down to 30% of current costs, that sort of thing. We've got some very interesting, quite exciting proposals coming. I can't, unfortunately, tell you very much about it at this stage, but watch this space. In a couple of months' time, we'll be able to publish. And I think it has revolutionary potential, because it's that exploitation. You could be earning the same amount of money in 50% of the time if you weren't giving 50% of it to a landlord, and having a life to fill with all these other wonderful things. Not just campaigning, it's crucially important, but so are all the other important things. The socializing, the parties, the connecting with nature, all the other things we need to be doing. We are deprived of this time. So many people in the past, Marx, Keynes, many others, foresaw a time when we would hardly have to do any work at all because there would be so much wealth in society. Well, there is all that wealth in society, but it's going straight into the pockets of the landlords. And this is an injustice which we have to overturn.
The lady in the middle. Did you get the mic yet? Good. And then I'll come to you at the front.
Hi, I'm Liberty. I was wondering, do you think universities could ever be treated as the commons rather than competitive, neoliberal, like private institutions? Thank you.
Good question.
I think it's really fun to imagine universities as being places really that stored knowledge about the universe and you really found out about how it worked. I think different land masses have an extraordinary amount to teach to people around the science and the ecosystems of that landmass. And universities in different locations, it would be great if the way that they worked actually reflected what the wisdom was in that local area that needed to be taught to the people who wanted to move into a position of responsibility and guardianship, or go to that area to learn from the skills or wisdoms that come from that landmass or continent. So, yeah, I would. I'm definitely quoting in some aspects of this Thomas Berry in the great work, in terms of very strongly wanting to call in that we have an education system that really allows people to become their highest selves, manifest on the planet, and not, puppets of the state. So, yeah.
Thank you.
I would love to see a move towards the common ownership of learning. I mean, for God's sake, it is a common resource, and of course it's going in completely opposite direction with the sort of capitalization, the managerial cultures, the market fundamentalism, the neoliberalism of universities, where vice-chancellors are scooping up 400,000 quid a year and stuff for running the institution into the ground. I don't know about this particular one, but that's a general trend
down the road,
which seems to be happening, while the students are just treated, they're just processed like sausages and made to pay ridiculous fees. I mean, obviously, there's a problem in that the students are transient. You're only there for 3 or 4 years, and so the sort of control of the resource is slightly harder, but the faculty can certainly control the resource if it is allowed to. And of course, it's all gone wrong, and we do need to reclaim higher education. And let's have not just universities, let's have diversities. At the moment, they are truly universities in that they're pushing us into just one way of thinking, particularly in the economics departments and the business schools, which seem to be taking everything over. It's only one way of looking at the world, and we're seeing a revolt now by economics students saying, sorry mate, there are far more ways of looking at the world. There are so many ways of looking at it from an economic perspective which are not about neoliberal or neoclassical economics. We want diversity in our teaching. We do not want university in our teaching.
Thank you. Okay. So I know because I haven't got this quite right, we need to move the mic to the guy at the front here, and then the Hamilton House crew will say a word. And then I really ought to take somebody on this side at the back then. So perhaps there's the person with his hand straight up very powerfully, quite near to you. Yeah. Jay. And then I have to tell you that we're going to need, let's keep these kind of really short if you want to get many more in. So, we're coming towards what we want to do next for the last few minutes. Where are we? You, sir.
Hi. Yeah, I'm Pete. I work in the curious position of working with celebrities. I'm a sound engineer. So I'm around them a lot. And I've noticed there's a big problem with the connection between the celebrities and their fans. So the idolization of the celebrity as an object, and the disconnect between people trying to fix their problems through that idolization of the celebrity. That seems to be a really big problem. And this is driving a force when these fans meet a celebrity. They're not getting the time to express. They're not expressing truthfully, and they're not accepting their true power, like you were saying, the higher self. I believe that if they directed those energies inward, then they would naturally get to the point where they would reconnect with nature. They'd reconnect with all of these things that seem to be natural things, but they're not happening in our society. So my question would be, how do we go about changing that? Because mass marketing and media is so powerful, and it's run by the neoliberal elite, which obviously is going to move towards its own interests. How do we start to break down that power?
I think you could say neoliberal elite, or you could say a bunch of magicians who are saying, hey, look here, well, at the same time grabbing a whole load of things because your attention's grabbed elsewhere. So just don't do that. you know, stay really centered and build a relationship with the natural world around you. Yeah, yeah. And then use the internet and use those things in ways that serve you and what you want to do.
The media serves us terribly in this respect. And I have to say, I'm afraid to say that The Guardian falls into the same category. I mean, almost half the major featured interviews in The Guardian are with actors. Why? Why are the people we want to hear from people who make their living by impersonating someone else and speaking someone else's words? Shouldn't we be hearing from the people who actually originate the words, for a start?
Yeah.
Look at all the amazing things that people do. Look at these amazing people. Look at these amazing people. I mean, I'm not saying that actors are all uninteresting. I'm sure there's some very interesting actors, but I'm sure that you're just as interesting as they are. And I'm sure that some of you have actually had richer life experiences than certain actors who get interviewed everywhere. Why do we do this? Why do we get locked into this? I think if I were to sit down with the editors of The Guardian and ask them why they're doing this, they wouldn't even realize that they'd been doing it.
Sure.
It's because of the saturation effect, because we're completely surrounded in this. So it's incumbent on us who see this, who see that there's a problem, to say we create alternative polarities, we create different ways of being. And of course, you know, we now have far more control through social media. And so sort of, you know, let's get a tweet storm going, saying no more celebrity tweeting. Let's ignore celebrities. Let's just ignore celebrities.
Ignore them. So next time you buy The Guardian, take out the...
Just rip out those pages. In fact, rip out all the pages except
take out the
one with my
cooking, because you'll want that, and then chuck the rest, and don't look at it. I went to a festival called Bylines Festival the other day, and there was a really, really good panel on Putin and Trump, and it was particularly heading into their relationship. And when asked, well, what do I do about this, by one of the audience members at the end, the woman who was Russian, actually, and had spent a fair amount of time in prison, said, just when you feel your button, you know, your finger hovering over the button which is going to tell you whatever lie Trump has told next, don't go there, because it's just feeding that whole process. And that's all we as individuals, goes back a bit to what can I do, you know, what can we do as individuals, just don't go there, because it feeds all that process. So shred the actors in The Guardian. Go for it.
Hello. My name's Claire. I'm here with the Save Hamilton House campaign. Thanks. Just want to say, massive thank you for inviting us here today, and a massive thank you to everyone who's already supported the campaign so far. It's really, really amazing. We're really appreciative. I guess my question was, as a representative of that, but also just as a concerned citizen who feels really disempowered at the moment. It links in with what you were saying earlier about universities and about landlords and about sort of living within this system and trying to work within these parameters that are so hard to break out of. I'm really interested in what you were saying, Peter, about the difference between organising on the ground and actually you're sort of waiting for change to come from above. And at the moment, we're running this campaign and we're doing loads and loads of stuff on the ground. But at the end of the day, all of the power is with these landlords who own our building, and they can choose to sell it to us, or they can choose to just ignore the bids that we put together. And we're doing all this stuff on the ground, but it feels like this impossible task, because at the end of the day, people just say, well, it's their building, they can do what they want. And so I'm really interested what your thoughts are and what we can do as a collective in this room now. What practical steps can we take to achieve the impossible and actually bring that building into community ownership?
Thank you. Do you know, George, what Hamilton House is?
No.
I just wondered. So, correct me if I'm... Yeah.
Sorry, I should have...
Sorry, I shouldn't have asked that like that. No, I mean, my understanding is it was a building with masses of different community organisations which were either given with cheap or lower rent, which allowed a whole mass of fantastic community projects to take place. And now its ownership is about to change. Does the owner now sell it because they want to knock it down and do something in a more conventional way?
Well, under the current legal framework, which with my group of people we're working to look at what policies we need to change that. Legally, obviously, there's not a lot you can do in a situation like this, but politically, there's a great deal you can do, and it is amazing how politics changes the application of law. And you make a big enough fuss, you get enough people out on the street, you basically put enormous pressure on the council, and I know, who knows who these people are? Maybe they're some sort of offshored entity based in the Cayman Islands. I've no idea whatsoever, so they might be very hard to reach. But sometimes, just sometimes, people feel the reputational risk here is too great, and we're going to back off. Can I just ask you, do you know who the beneficial owners are?
Yes, so the owner's a property developer called Connolly and Callaghan, and they're based in Bristol.
And they're based in Bristol.
They're based in they're based in Hamilton House. We see them every day.
So these are real people. Well,
these are real people.
Well,
that
that's
we
a
know.
great start. That's a great start. Have you got a sympathetic local press on this issue?
We did get a lot of press recently. A couple of weeks ago, we ran an amazing Save Hamilton House campaign. Ran an incredible march in Bristol. We had over 1,000 people out on the street. So we got a lot of local media coverage. We got one story in The Guardian from that. And off the back of that, we had the Mayor of Bristol, Marvin Rees, and the Deputy Mayor, Asher Craig, have got in touch. They called us up late on a Friday night and said, we'd love to support you in a very non-committal way, no promises, but, we'll do whatever we can.
And have you got any dialogue with the owners? Are they talking to you?
You might be able to... Thomas has just been in a meeting with them right now, so you might be able to speak to that better than me.
This has put me on the spot. We have this constant catch-22 where on one side they need the finances, as they say, to refurbish the building and the security of us paying the lease. We can't afford that because it's dependent on us having a 10-year lease in the first place, and it's dependent on grant funding and other charity organisation grants and similar. And there's that disconnect between what we would be able to do and what we need to be able to do it, which is a 10-year lease, so we can invest and create that opportunity, and what their requirements are, which is essentially that we have this already in place before we even start to then sign a 10-year lease. And there's this impasse we have constantly.
Have you looked at crowdfunding to raise the money to be able to buy the 10-year lease?
We did I'll answer this one. We did a bid to buy the building last year, and that was turned down, and that was based in part on crowdfunding and financing through various funding sources. But ultimately, it's their decision not to have sold it to us. So we have this constant battle of how to make something or bring it into community ownership if there's just reluctance.
And is there immediate a step where you just get the lease rather than buying the building, which you could crowdfund for? Would that be less in terms of raising impact investment and really, because I have a niece who lives in Middlesbrough who'd heard of the Republic of Stokes-Croft and Hamilton House, and she's like, oh, this is it. It goes far beyond the value of it, goes far beyond Stokes-Croft. If Bristol, if it's going to be done, it can be done here. It just feels that it has to happen here. And I just wonder if there's an impact investment fundraise that can happen rather than buying the building, maybe as a short-term step, just to even get the lease for another 5 years, so you've got time to gather and look at it again. Is that something?
Of course, we try as many avenues as there are open to us. One of the things that we have, which is because there's such a wide community in the building and we have the scale of a very large building, the interconnection between all those groups is very valuable and very resourceful for a lot of people. Scale is a really important thing, and yet that value is not reflected in finances. Value there, the social capital, social currency, social capital, it's all there. It's been fostered over 10 years. So we don't have access to convert that to finances to then generate a lease that's suitable for them. Now, a share funding option, grant funding, we've looked at these, but it's their choice ultimately, it's their building, and we have this impasse of not meeting what they exactly need.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, one last thing, charitable bonds by Alia. Alia have looked at how you actually reflect the value of, for example, prisoners not going back to prison or care. And they look at the value of these interrelationships and the value on the wider community. And I think they've raised over £200 million, helped charities raise over £200 million in charitable bonds. So I just wonder if that's another thing to look at. And I can give you a contact there if that's something you would like to look at after
yes, please.
Yeah.
Thank
Good. So do have those connections. And I think the guy who's going to talk or speak in a moment, Jay, may also have some thoughts on this. I mean, I felt it was worth us having a bit of a longer conversation on that because it's so much something that's live and for you. But I can't help feeling with whatever we are, 200 people in the room, there are probably also people in the room who may know someone who might know someone who may be able to help these guys. Because it's a really interesting project, and it's much more than that because it's what's happening all over the place. So it's also a precedent that can be hugely useful. Jay, there. And then we'll take, and actually, tell you what, I wouldn't mind going somewhere far back. Hang on half a second, Jay. Yeah, this lady there. And then we're going to end at that point after you, so you can have the final word. Don't say that Jeremy Corbyn's going to solve everything, because I'll give you the same answer as Khan did. Jay.
Okay, hello. He's not, because that was going to be my question. No, just a joke. I'm an immigrant from California. I live in Totnes. I'm involved in a few different things. So I'd be happy to talk with you guys if you want to about things that I'm part of. DART, there's the charter process that's going, which is a practical step. I'm involved with something called the Reconomy Project. I'm involved with something called Control Shift, Emergency Summit for Change. We just had our first event in March on the anniversary of Article 50, the Brexit process starting. We're going to have our next emergency summit this coming March. And my question is about how do we build an effective movement for positive change? Because it hasn't really been addressed at this talk so far, but we have mentioned neoliberalism, 40 years of it, and the deindustrialization of those places that voted heavily Brexit. We've had 10 years of austerity, and where's the effective movement for positive change? There's lots of people doing things, lots of organizations and networks, but I guess my hypothesis is that we don't have one because whatever it is that we're doing isn't working. And the culture of change making is too London-centric and a little bit disconnected. There were so many London-based sort of left progressive elites and change makers and campaigners who were actually surprised. So I'm just wondering about your thoughts about how we can get past that and get into a new culture around change making and build a movement that will actually make some headway.
Thank you.
Well, I think that might have been a more valid question a couple of years ago, but what I see happening right now, I mean, I'm not saying it's not a valid question today, because it is, and you expressed it beautifully, but what I see happening is exactly this taking place within the Labour grassroots. Now, I'm not a party person, I've never been a member of any party, but I see a huge part of the problem as having been that the Labour Party, which was supposed to be the vehicle for that mass mobilisation of working and indeed middle-class people against the oligarchs, just wasn't fulfilling that role. And there was a long period under Blair and Brown where it became just another outlet for neoliberalism. Sure, softened, not nearly as virulent as the neoliberalism of the Conservative Party, but broadly speaking, a neoliberal party nonetheless. And so it deprived people of that forum for mass mobilization where, the Labour Party was the obvious place. Without it, we were kind of at sea. But it seems to me, whatever you think about the particular personalities involved and whatever you think about particular policies and positions that it's taken, what we see happening here is a national mass movement regenerating once more, through which there's a potential, isn't always fulfilled as yet, but I think there's a long, long way to go to start articulating a whole load of the things that we're interested in. And the way in which Labour now seems to be keen on this radical devolution of power and of becoming once more a party driven by its grassroots, and interestingly in this case not exclusively by the trade union grassroots, but by people mobilising outside the workplace as well, because the workplace is a much less hospitable place for mobilisation than it used to be, as we don't get the fixed workforce in very large workplaces, very large factories and the rest of it, which can mobilize together, but people are disaggregated, zero-hour contracts, hot desking, all the rest of it, false freelancing, the gig economy, all that makes the workplace a very difficult place to organize, but they're looking way beyond that. And I think we're seeing the stirrings of exactly this mass mobilization. Now, what we, as people with a particular concern, as I expect a lot of people in this audience have, with environmental issues have to do, is to start injecting some of that green thinking into the mass mobilization. Because at the moment, Labour are not switched on to environmental issues. But the vehicle is now there. It has returned, and I feel we have a duty to make use of it.
Thank you. So, the last question is the woman in the middle there.
Thank you. So this evening we've talked a lot about capitalism, the celebrity culture, education as things that exist as separate from us. And the first thing I'd like to say is, isn't the world that we've created a product of our collective mind? And can we use those things as a means, as a force for good? Wendy and I were having a discussion in the break about Sadhguru, who's a visionary and a mystic. And he's done just that in India. He started a campaign called Rally for Rivers last September, and it's turned into the biggest global environmental campaign with over 200 million people signing up to it in India and planting millions of trees. And he's done just that through tapping into those kind of, those corporations, celebrity culture, and so on. And I wonder if we could do that as well, as part of our thinking. Thank you.
Quick comments? Yeah.
I think it's I think that just in response to both of those questions, I think it's the same thing, is that it has to be there is a shift. It started to happen. Lots of this is converging, and you see, India is so wonderful and magic and chaotic and challenging, but they believe, we were saying that there's a belief in themselves, that they are empowered. And I think that's the thing. From the moment we walk into school begins the journey of disempowerment. And actually we have to believe that we are empowered to do just that. So when we look at policies or when we look at things that need doing, rather than saying, well, the local authority aren't doing it, well, let's do it and take it to the local authority. So take it home, bring it back. And so I would say that the solutions already exist. We know what they are. We have to question what the barriers are that prevent those solutions being implemented. And if it's mass mobilization, then let's look at how we do that. If it's just me stopping eating meat, or if it's me just changing a car, then why aren't I? So it's right back, it comes right back from the personal, why am I not doing this, right through to whatever level you're working at. The solutions are there, and I think mass mobilization has begun. And morphic resonance, we can be the change that we want to see in the world. We must be the change that we want to see in the world.
Thank you. You want to say something? Go on.
I would really like it if we could follow some of the inspiration that are given us from indigenous peoples who take care of over 80% of the world's biodiversity. I think that all of our systems, our education, our political structures, our businesses, our business plans, all of them need to be assessed with the Earth and the Earth's community at their core. And are they of benefit to the Earth's community? Are they of benefit to the planet in terms of the environmental impact that they have? And if they're not, then they need to be reassessed and, be supported so that they can get back and to reorganize themselves in such a way as what they are is nurturing the planet. And I think that's really simple, and it's really massive amount of work, and we can all get involved in that in all sorts of different forms and systems and businesses and groups.
Thank you. The question you asked was, is this not the world that we have created? And I would say probably by and large it is not the world that we have created. It is a world that has been created by an oligarchy which exercises its greatest power through the media, but through all sorts of other means as well, through corporate structure, through government structure, through hierarchies of all kinds, various kinds of social hierarchy. And to a very large extent, we have been left out of this process. And our role as citizens is to take back control. Not in the way that Leave UK means it, but to genuinely take back control. And this takes us back to the very beginning of the conversation and the need for a grassroots resurgence, a grassroots renaissance where we co-create our world. We co-produce our world. And we do so by developing community where community is lacking, developing communion where communion is lacking, developing connection where connection is lacking, expressing our full potential as empathetic, altruistic, engaged and community-minded human beings. And we are wild outliers as far as animal species are concerned by having all that in spades, more than any other animal species has, but, and this is a measure of the extent to which we have not created this world, it has been suppressed. Because despite the fact that we are such an altruistic and empathetic species, we allow psychopaths to govern us. And that is what needs to change. We have to govern ourselves, and we do it from the bottom up. Thank you.
Thank you.